Hey folks, welcome to the Sedgwick Jimmy channel. Today we're taking a look at the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And for you conspiracy theorists out there, 6 and 8 is 14, which added together is 5, and I'll just let you take it from there. So good luck. For everybody else, here's the story behind Henry's 6 wives, some of whom actually got to keep their heads. Let's get into it. Catherine of Aragon was born in 1485, the youngest child of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yes, the Columbus sending Ferdinand and Isabella. And she was a whopping 3 years old when it was decided that she would marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, the heir to the English crown, who himself was 2 at the time. They were married by proxy in 1499 when Arthur turned 15 and was deemed old enough to marry, and the two finally met and were married in 1501. Either way, the point of her marriage was that her mother came from a line of English royalty and nobility that actually gave Catherine more of a claim to the throne than the current king, Henry VII, who had only become king by defeating the previous king, Richard III, at the end of the War of the Roses. Monarchies are always interesting. Also, the two of them could barely understand each other in person because, though they had written back and forth in Latin, the only language they both knew, they had been taught different pronunciations. They moved to Ludlow Castle, and a few months later they both came down with what was known as the sweating sickness, which she survived, but he didn't. Now, with a widowed princess and a partially unpaid dowry on his hands, Henry decided to marry her to his next son, Henry VIII, who was 5 years younger than Catherine. It was decided that her marriage to Arthur hadn't been consummated, therefore not official, and she married Henry VIII in 1509, just after he ascended the throne. Catherine became pregnant 7 times, only 2 of the children living past birth, and only Mary, the future queen, and Bloody Mary lived past a few weeks. While Henry was away fighting in France, Scotland decided to invade England, and Catherine, left in charge and not just one to sit back and let things happen, had an army gathered. She then rode in full armor and pregnant to said army to address them in person. What followed was the rebuffing of the invasion and the Battle of Flodden Field. She was a good queen and a good wife, however she hadn't produced any male heirs, and seeing as she was passing out of childbearing years, Henry began to look elsewhere, and by elsewhere I mean Anne Boleyn. Henry began to argue the legitimacy of his marriage, that she and Arthur had in fact consummated their marriage, making his invalid. He sent a messenger to speak with the Pope, Clement VII, who was being held prisoner by the Holy Roman Empire and Catherine's nephew, Charles V, following the latter's sack of Rome. From here, you have the Pope say no to an annulment, which Henry ignored, establishing himself as the head of the church in England and banishing Catherine from the castle. She lived out the rest of her life in Kimbolton Castle and died 3 years later of either poisoning or most likely cancer. Anne Boleyn married Henry in 1533, her sister having been one of Henry's mistresses and possibly the mother of 2 illegitimate sons, and Anne refused to play the same game. She demanded that he make her a queen, or technically a queen consort, rather than a mistress, and he married her quickly after his marriage to Catherine was annulled. And shortly after that, or perhaps a little before, we're not totally sure, she became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth I. She miscarried her second child, though by that time Henry had started to grow tired of her, had begun to court another woman, Jane Seymour. We'll get to her. Rumors of Anne being unfaithful began, though we have no evidence of any indiscretions, and soon 5 men, including Anne's brother George, were brought in and questioned, eventually going on trial and being found guilty of treason. Anne was put on trial for adultery, incest, and treason, of which she was found guilty. Rather than the normal traitor's death, which for a woman was being burned at the stake, Henry commuted it to beheading and had a swordsman brought in rather than use the normal axe. She was executed on May 19, 1536, and buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London's chapel. Henry did not witness the execution as he was too busy hunting at the time. It's worth adding that since her death, and even up to modern times, people have claimed to see her ghost in the tower with her head tucked underneath her arm. So his first marriage ended with Henry telling the Pope, "Screw you, I'll run my own church," and the second with a beheading. Henry wasn't having the best time of it. He began courting Jane about 3 months before Anne Boleyn's execution and married her the day after. Jane had served as maid of honor for both Catherine and Anne and was sympathetic to what had happened to Catherine, which made her rather popular with the people as well as Henry's oldest daughter, Mary. And though they were wed, Jane was never actually crowned queen consort, seeing as the plague hit London around that time, and to be honest, Henry wanted to make sure she could produce a male heir first. And in October 1537, she did just that, giving birth to Henry's only male child to live past infancy, Edward VI. However, less than 2 weeks later, she died of complications from childbirth. She was the only wife of Henry to receive a queen's funeral, and it was next to her grave that Henry chose to be buried when he passed. Her death also changed Henry as he began to put on weight and developed gout. Anne of Cleves was born in Dusseldorf, the second daughter of John III, and because her family had a rich lineage and royalty, she was considered the perfect fit to be Henry's newest wife. However, so was her younger sister Amelia, and Henry being Henry, he sent renowned painter Hans Holbein the Younger to paint their portraits, expressly telling him not to embellish them at all and to be as close to lifelike as possible. Yeah, Henry chose which one he would marry because of their pictures. This was rather important. See, when they finally met, Henry was not impressed by her looks and felt that the portrait of her had, in fact, been embellished. This led to Thomas Cromwell, a close advisor to the king and the man who had pushed Henry to marry Anne, both Boleyn and of Cleves, to fall from grace, and he ended up being tried for treason and executed. Thomas, by the way, was the great-great-uncle of Oliver Cromwell, who would be rather important about 100 years later. So Henry was looking for a way out of the marriage even before the ceremony, but when they were married in January, the king failed to consummate the marriage, which he blamed on Anne's appearance. By June, Anne had been asked to leave the court and was informed that the king was looking to have their marriage annulled. She agreed to the annulment, though she and Henry remained friends, and she actually stayed on as a member of his court for another 15 years. She built good relationships with Henry's daughters, which earned her the ire of Henry's final wife, who we'll get to, and she finally left the court around 1554. She died most likely of cancer in 1557, outliving Henry and all of his wives. Catherine Howard was born in 1523, the 10th of 11 children, and was Anne Boleyn's first cousin. After her mother died when she was 5, she went to live with the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where she was to be educated and trained in aristocracy. In 1538, at 15 years old, she was sent to another of the Duchess's household, where she met Francis Derham. The two began a secret relationship, referring to each other as husband and wife, and supposedly drew up a pre-marriage contract before he left for Ireland. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, arranged for her a place in the household of Anne of Cleves, where she grabbed Henry's eye, but also the eye of Henry's favorite courtier, Thomas Culpeper. Catherine and Henry were married in July 1540. Yeah, Henry didn't take much time, when he was 49 and she was about 16, though again she was not crowned queen in a coronation. When she became part of Henry's court, she was reunited with Culpeper, whom she had considered marrying while working for Anne of Cleves, and the two most likely began an affair. We're not 100% certain, but we're pretty damn sure. Once word of her sexual activity prior to meeting the king reached Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he began an investigation. He learned of her relationship with Derham as well as the possible existence of a pre-marriage contract. If this contract existed and the two had had sex afterwards, this constituted them being married, which nullified her marriage to Henry. This is also when her secret meetings with Culpeper came to light, and both Derham and Culpeper were arrested and questioned. Culpeper admitted that he had intentions of having an affair with the queen, but they had never done anything, and he had tried to break things off when she came on to him. But when a love letter was found in his chambers from Catherine, his fate was pretty much sealed. Derham admitted that they had had a sexual relationship before Catherine met Henry, but he had never signed a pre-marriage contract with her. The Archbishop also arrested several others, including Jane Boleyn, George's widow and Catherine's lady-in-waiting, who played lookout during Culpeper's visits. Catherine was asked to leave court and held in waiting at Sion Abbey, awaiting her fate. When questioned, she denied any involvement with Culpeper, though others testified that she had told him that she wished that she had married him rather than the king, and claimed that her relationship with Derham had been non-consensual, contrary to all evidence and other testimonies. To cut to the chase, everyone was executed for treason. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered, while Culpeper, Boleyn, and Catherine were all beheaded. Catherine was buried, like Anne Boleyn, in an unmarked grave in the Tower's chapel. As you can tell from the pattern, Henry had a thing for Anne's and Catherine's, which leads us to Catherine Parr. No, she didn't play golf. Henry's sixth and final wife. She was born in 1512, the eldest child of Sir Thomas Parr, who was friends with Henry, and Maud Green, who was close friends with Catherine of Aragon. So close that the Queen was Catherine's godmother and who she was named after. In 1529, at 17, Catherine married Sir Edward Burrough, though he was known for poor health and died in 1533. In 1534, she married John Neville, becoming Lady Latimer and the stepmother of 2 children. In 1536, John was dragged away by a mob during what was known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, and she was left alone with her stepchildren for about 6 months, awaiting his return. It was during this time that a mob raided the castle, holding Catherine and the children hostage for John's return, where he was able to talk them down and into leaving. However, conflicting reports were sent to the king as to whether Neville was a victim or conspirator, and this practically destroyed his reputation. They moved down south where Neville could attend a parliament, and Catherine rekindled her friendship with Mary. It was here that she met Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane, but we'll get to him later. In 1542, Neville fell into poor health and died in 1543. Catherine then became part of Mary's household, beginning a relationship with Thomas Seymour. However, she also caught the king's eye, and seeing as he needed a queen, plus he was the king, and king kind of trumps everything, Catherine and Henry were said to be married. And they were married in July 1543, and by 1544, Henry was gone off a warren in France, leaving Catherine in charge. She handled her position very well, teaching a young Elizabeth how to properly run a kingdom. She was also able to persuade the king to reconnect with his daughters and place them back into the line of succession after Edward. When Henry died in 1547 of natural but not completely understood causes, his will left Catherine a yearly stipend, as well as the fact that she remained queen as if he were still alive. Henry's son Edward ascended to the throne, and a little over 6 months after his death, Catherine married Thomas Seymour. Told you he'd be back. She became pregnant for the first time in 4 marriages in late 1547, giving birth to a daughter named Mary in 1548, but soon dying after complications from the birth. She was given a public burial that only royal to get such, and Thomas ended up being beheaded for treason in 1549, with Mary sent to live with the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, where she disappears from history around 1550. And that's just going to about do it for our quick look at the 6 wives of Henry VIII. We hope you liked it, and we hope you give us a like and or subscribe, or head on down to the comments and let us hear your 2 cents. We thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time for more Sedgwick Jimmy. Come check it out.